Joining us now is Frank Zaccanelli.
Frank Zaccanelli.
Frank Zaccanelli.
Frank Zaccanelli.
Let's welcome Frank Zaccanelli.
Live from the Real News Studios in Dallas, Texas, welcome to the To Be Frank Show. Your host, Frank Zaccanelli, has been in the world of domestic and international business and professional sports for 40 years. And as a former minority owner, president, and general manager of the Dallas Mavericks, he's been asked to comment on current events in the national news for most of his professional career. But what he and many others are really looking for is a place to find just the facts. Welcome to the To Be Frank Show.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the To Be Frank Show, filmed live from Dallas, Texas. I'm your host, Frank Zaccanelli, and I'm really happy to be doing this show and be with you today. My background really is all about business. I've been involved in domestic in the U.S. and international business for over 40 years. And the interesting thing about all of that is that it's come by way of a lot of experience and a lot of really fun things that I've had the privilege of actually being involved with. All the way from, business activities, from the real estate development business to forming companies, to really being involved in the NBA with the Dallas Mavericks. And then international related things such as raising $250 million just recently out of China for the EB-5 program, which is a United States government-sponsored program that ultimately lends itself to jobs and economic development. It's really part of the immigration system in the United States. So the interesting thing about it is, why would somebody like me really want to do a show like this? Well, I've been a byproduct, like a lot of you, I think, that are out there today, in really getting most of my news in your traditional ways. I remember when I was a kid and I'd come home from school, my parents would be huddled around the television at 6 o'clock at night waiting for Walter Cronkite to come on. And that's when we lived in a world that basically had 3 television networks, and you got your news in very sporadic manner. You either got it on the radio or you got it from the national news broadcast that lasted about 30 minutes. 40 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Ted Turner changed the world. And what he did with his evolution and invention of CNN, he changed the world. He brought news directly into your living room on a 24/7 basis. And the beauty of really that was something that I think really has resonated, that people now really depend on the 24/7 news cycle. And Ted Turner, in my opinion, changed the world. He was a guy that was an incredible innovator. We actually even fought wars on CNN. For those of you that are old enough to know about the Iraq conflict and the Iraq War in the early 90s, that was really fought on CNN. It was fought on television. And so many, many, many great innovations occurred as it relates to cable news and 24/7 news. The problem is now, in today's world in 2020, a lot of my peer group and most everyone that I talk to has become somewhat disillusioned with the way that news is being presented now, especially in the United States. But this carries over directly also to Europe, to Spain, to Italy, to France. This carries over from the standpoint that people do not have the confidence in the way that the news is being presented to them like they might have had, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And again, it's a byproduct of the way the world has changed. It's also a byproduct, quite frankly, of a situation politically, especially here in the United States, where we have this canyon-wide divide in the middle of our country between separate ideologies that ultimately now have created this gigantic gap. And part of the promise, I hope, of this podcast and this show, the To Be Frank Show, is going to be that we're going to try to dig in to the issues that really matter to real people. We're not going to get political whatsoever. That is the main charter for what I've tried to do with this show, is that we're going to strip all the politics out of this show. And we're going to try to now really get down to core issues that really affect people's lives, not only here again in the United States, but around the world. We have got the ability now, because of technology and my partners, to be able to broadcast in many, many different languages. We're starting out with Spanish and with French and with Italian and Mandarin Chinese, but we have the ability with the technology that we have to be able to broadcast in 78 different languages around the world. And, as an old dinosaur myself, my kids have really got me up to speed through the years about podcasting and how it works and how many people you actually reach. Because, I've had a history of doing things on CNN and Fox and CNBC. I've been a talking head, but I've become disillusioned with all of that. And let me tell you why I think not only myself, but a lot of the people, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, have become disillusioned with the way that network television and cable television works. The ideology has become so thick and so robust that you really can't get the basic news anymore. And I'm a television junkie. I'm a sports junkie. I'm a television junkie. My background in the NBA, but I love football. I love soccer. I do all these things, through the medium of television. But it's become increasingly difficult to really get your news anymore from the television medium. Politicalization, if you will, has become so rampant that every talking head, every person has an ideology that they're basically talking to people about. And the news is being left behind. You take a look at some of the current things that are really going on in our country today and going on in the world today. Obviously, COVID-19 is dominating the airwaves, as it should, because it is the most significant, severe pandemic that we've had in this country in 100 years. But not only has it affected people in the United States, it's affected people worldwide. And as we speak today in our inaugural broadcast, episode 1 of the 2B Frank Show, things are exploding in certain parts of the United States. Now, one of my problems in the beginning of this COVID issue, in this pandemic, was that people got split along party lines. They really split about how they viewed this pandemic. And there's no way that from a scientific standpoint that could be possible other than the thickness of the politics that are involved here. When we look at our country here and we look at the world as a whole, no one can sit and really say anymore that the politics are working really for anyone. We have a gigantic divide in this country between Democrat and Republican, between conservative and liberal. And to be candid, my philosophy has always been we have to govern from the center. I am a guy that operates everything that I do from the complete center. I don't have ideology that drives what I talk about, why I talk about it, my businesses. I want to operate from the center. And I think what's happened in our country is that there is no more center left. My parents were Kennedy Democrats. You can't find even any resemblance of what a Kennedy Democrat even means anymore. What it meant in the day were hardworking people that basically were interested in building a great country. If we want to solve all the problems that we have in the United States of America, and I would suggest around the world, follow the plight of the immigrant. Because when you follow the plight of the immigrant, the only interest that the immigrant had, which really built this country, was leaving a better life for their children. And when you really think about that, that's the real essence of why anyone would come here, become American, and try to build the country. In today's world, along with all of the social problems, which we're going to cover on this show, we're going to cover Black Lives Matter in a really deep way. We're going to really get into the core issues as it relates to the movement, what it means, and how, quite frankly, we can change things that everybody can get on board. But we're not going to be able to change the country or the world as long as people are polarized to the level that they're polarized today. And the whole Black Lives movement really, became very important in most every major city in Europe. You look at the protests, you look at what's happened. Here in our country, though, the protests have really gone a step beyond now protesting. And it's become destruction of public property. It's become things that ultimately the average American really can't grab a hold of. And I wonder how we can get to a point in the African American community and all the minority communities where we can understand the plight of those communities and we can fix the problem. In my opinion, the only way we're going to fix the problem is we got to get dead center. We can't operate again in this polarization side of what we're presently involved with. So this show is really going to be all about, I think, four major topics, four major areas of topics, if you will. We're going to talk a lot about current events, and we're going to try to get down to the core of how these current events really affect you as a human being. The coronavirus, Black Lives Matter, all these things that are surrounding us. We have to really get our arms around, and we have to figure out how do we solve these issues in a non-political way. I think that when you really take a look at the current events around the world, the COVID-19 issue is gigantic. I mean, you take a look today, we all wake up here in the United States and we've had 37 or 38,000 new cases that were diagnosed and put into the system yesterday. That's an enormous amount of people, because when you look at numbers on a television screen, they become numbers. But when you really break it down, these are human beings. We've lost about 120 some odd thousand people, and it's projected that we're going to lose a lot more. And all the arguments are, well, people aren't getting that sick, or these are older people, or these are this, or these are that. All of that is now being blown away by the real information that we're getting. And on this show, we're going to dedicate the first 3 episodes to the COVID-19 issue, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And we're going to get down to what are the real issues. We're going to bring scientists on that have a non-political view. My goal for this is if any politics creep into this show, I'm cutting them out. I don't want to have the narrative be a political narrative which is governed now by your news channels. I mean, you watch one news channel and they tell the story of an important current event and you get one view of the world. You turn the channel and you look at another network and you don't even know that they're talking about the same issue because you just watched something on a different network, but yet they have a completely different view and a different take, all being directed by politics and ideology. All of the talking heads. I was a talking head, for years on television, and I got so bored with it because in 3 or 4 or 5 minute segments, you really can't get anything done. It's all about advertisers. It's all about spewing an ideology. If they don't like what you're talking about, you pretty much get cut off. You get asked questions that really don't even pertain to anything. I mean, those are the issues that people now are dealing with. And I'm telling you that even in my age bracket, even with people that are kind of at the end of their business careers, they've had enough of this. They really want information. They want news. People are yearning for that. And so that's what we're hoping to be able to provide on the To Be Frank show. I've made a few notes here for myself. In terms of the topics for the show, we're going to talk about the current events that are facing not only America, but people in Europe and people around the world. And we want to break those down with really, really smart people that are going to leave the politics at home and are going to talk about important information that will help you, the viewer, be able to really understand the issue a lot better. And so that's going to become a big part of this. In terms of business things, we're going to cover some business things. My background is that. Business can be overlaid in all of these social issues. You just take what's going on here in the United States right now. With COVID, you've got an issue as it relates to how has that affected people's lives? How has it affected the economy? How has it affected their paycheck? How has it affected their business? I mean, it's been a gigantic driver to a lot of problems that we're facing today. 21 million people today that were working 3 or 4 months ago are still out of work. And the question then becomes, with the spike now that we're seeing, especially in some of these southern states, you know, there was another big discussion, you know, 2-3 months ago. Oh, wow, well, when the weather changes and the humidity gets up and everything's great, you know, this virus, quote unquote, is going to go away. Well, I would say Florida, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, California have put a gigantic hole into that theory. Not only is the virus not going away, it's expanding. So how does that affect people's lives? Well, people are unemployed, businesses are suffering, and you take a look at what is the impact to the business side. You go to Europe. Europe has a completely different set of standards in which they operate under. Let's take France for an example. France has a situation, and even Germany, where if you're not working, you're getting supplemented to a level by the governments. And that is the reason that the tax base is so high. It is much more of a socialist environment. Here in the United States, the COVID thing is hit big because we're a capitalist society. We are a society that ultimately depends on people going out and earning and working. You know, they went ahead and they really didn't have much choice. And the government of the United States went out and basically said, hey, we've got to put together programs. They added over $3 trillion to our national debt, which now sits somewhere between 22 trillion and 25 trillion. They added $3 trillion to the national debt. But it sits somewhere between 22 trillion and 25 trillion. Those are staggering numbers. So we're going to get into what effect does that really have on your life? How is that affecting interest rates? How is it affecting all aspects? And our children and grandchildren are going to have to deal with this. In France, in Italy, in Greece, you know, places in Europe, the percent of national debt in those countries has been over 100% of the GNP, of the actual gross product that's being, generated. So they've had that problem for a long, long time. They've had debt that's been piled up. And part of their socialized programs there are the government is basically going to stand behind those workers. Whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, we're not here to justify what they're doing or what we're doing. What we're going to try to do is give the facts out about what it really means. How does that implement into what happens from this point forward? So those are the types of things economically that are being really, impacted, if you will, by the coronavirus. Now you take a look at the Black Lives Matter movement. Clearly, urban cities have been, in some areas, shut down. The protests, which were absolutely warranted, the protests that were warranted. What was not warranted was the vandalism and some of the stuff that occurred after the protests got started. Because I believe that 90 to 95% of the protesters were there for good reason. They wanted their voices to be heard. It's a major part of our culture here in America. You know, the ability to have free speech and to protest is a major part of our Constitution, and it should be embraced. But when it gets to a point where vandalism occurs and people lose their businesses and more damage is done, that doesn't really solve anything. And what we're going to do is we're going to really talk about what actually does solve the problem. We're going to get so non-political on this. It's not going to be about Donald Trump or Joe Biden. It's not going to be about Democrats and Republicans. It's going to be about what solves the problem here. What can actually create the equality that the minorities in this country seek? In terms of policing, there's no question there's got to be changes. I mean, you're not even in the same universe if you don't understand that there's got to be some changes here. But those changes have got to be agreed to, and they've got to be done properly. I mean, I could tell you that I have been involved. Disbanding the police is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. That's one of the dumbest ideas that anyone has ever come up with, because the police protect people in the minority communities even more than they protect people in the suburbs. So that idea has got to go away. We've got to get real solutions, though, to the policing problem. Are minorities targeted? It sure looks like it to me. And so those are the things that got to be solved. But I know in my business career, when I was a young businessman, I had to take certain psychology tests for certain jobs where they wanted to know my background. They wanted to know about what I thought about things and all the screening that needs to be done. And I think the screening for police officers has got to go back into their childhood, into their background, into their family background. Because police officers cannot go into that job with a bias. When they enter into a job like that with a bias, only bad things happen. So we've got to really be able to figure out how that works. In terms of the one and done policy that I think should be part of every scenario, if a police officer has a problem with understanding the basic principles, he's gone or she's gone to another career. We've got to be able to clean this out. It's almost like the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic. It's almost like the Catholic Church. They let priests get away with things over the years that they shouldn't have let happen, and they had to deal with it. And it's not a pleasant thing for the Catholic Church. Now, as a Catholic, I hope that they're cleaning this up and we don't have any more challenges or problems, with young kids being at risk. But it's the same type of thing. It's a one and done policy here. And again, very candidly, then it all boils down to training. You got to be able to have the training. And it's got to be ongoing. And it's got to be something that ultimately lends itself to a culture. You got to remember, people become their environment. If you create a good environment for people, and you put bad people into a good environment, there's a very good chance they're going to become their environment. But equally, if you take really good people and you put them into a bad environment, guess what's going to happen? They're not going to become good people for long. They're not going to stay good people for long. So environment is everything. And what we've got to do in this country, but certainly in the police forces of this country, is we got to create the right environment. So that will become another major issue about things that on this show we're going to want to talk about. Again, I talked a lot about the effects on business. And everybody is concerned. Think about the people that took their life savings and went out and started a business. And they put their heart and soul into it, and they did it properly. If you take the COVID thing and that pandemic, that was a gigantic setback for people, no matter what business they were in. But in the restaurant business, in the hospitality business, they were hit terribly through no fault of their own. And then you take a look at, people in businesses in other walks of life. They're also dramatically affected. And along with the businesses, you got to remember again, in this country, the vast majority of jobs are created by small business. These small businesses have really been hit. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at that not only here, but we're going to take a look at that in Spain, in France, and in Italy. And how is that really affected people that are basically on the ground and in the middle of that? So that's going to become a major topic as we go forward about how does all this affect people's lives. And then, because of my background, we're going to talk a lot about sports. But the issue with sports really now has become, sports have become incredibly political. They really have. The sports world now is really caught up in the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's whether or not it's soccer in Italy, it's basketball in the United States, it's soon to be football. Every sporting venue has been now caught up with this in terms of how do the politics of that intercede into the beginning to start to open up the sports side. Here in the United States, and I spoke about this several years ago on national television, you're going to have a lot of debates as it relates to the national anthem. How does that interplay in with the protests and the athletes that are going to decide that they may not want to stand for the national anthem, they may want to kneel for the national anthem, or worse. We don't know what the situation is. I said over 2 years ago, and I'll say it today, I think fundamentally everyone has the right in this country to either stand or not stand for the anthem. Okay? For me, and I had a guy on national television ask me, why do they even play the national anthem? Well, for those of you in Europe and elsewhere, it's a major part of the whole sporting event is that your country's national anthem is being played. So they asked me, why is that? I said, well, it's culture. It's what we do in the sports world. But I believe that the protesting of not standing for the national anthem has to lead to real change that ultimately then gets our country back as one country. I'll give you a great anecdote. About a month ago, I had the reason of calling a guy that I had hired in the NBA. And he's in his mid-80s. And he's a wonderful guy. I'm not going to mention his name, but he's a wonderful guy. And we had a nice chat. And I said, hey, I hope you take care of yourself. You're of the age where you really got to pay attention to this. And I said, this is the worst thing that I've seen with COVID-19. It's the worst thing that I've seen in the United States since I've been alive. It's the worst scenario. I never thought anything could be worse than 9/11. And 9/11 was horrific. And I'm not trying to compare problems to other problems. But for me, this thing is so widespread and it's worldwide. It's the worst thing that I've seen in my lifetime. And I asked him, I said, you're older than me. And he said, yes, I was a child in World War II. And he said, World War II was tough. But he said there was one big difference between World War II and the time of World War II and what we're dealing with today. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, the country was together during World War II. We were one nation. In today's world, he said, we're so divided that we can agree on nothing. It was almost an epiphany for me to really hear that, because it really then set into stone some of the things that I've been seeing and I've been feeling as it relates to where our country is and where we're going. We're not going to be able to operate at any level like this in our country. It's just not going to happen. It can't happen. And so we've got to make the changes necessary to bring this country back together. We used to be, people in Washington would go up and they would debate things and they would talk about things and they would do it. And all the way down to our local governments. You take a look now, this scenario that we're dealing with in the United States has become now an issue even in local government. Mayors don't agree with governors, that don't agree with the president, that don't agree with Congress. We can go on and on and on and on and on about this canyon-wide divide that I've been talking about here. It's gigantic. And we're going to have to figure out exactly how we bridge this gap, or I can honestly tell you we won't get anything done. In Europe, things are a little bit more cemented together based on the form of government. But what's going to happen there, unfortunately, is the one thing that Europeans are not going to be able to deal with are even higher taxes than what they're paying today. It's just not going to be something that's going to be accepted very well, because they're getting taxed right now at levels that are far beyond the United States. And then when you really take a look at Europe again, when it becomes this debt to gross national product issue, and I'm going to get into that in shows where we're going to break it down, and I'm going to show the numbers. But remember, the major countries in Europe are over 100% debt to that gross national product. Unfortunately now, if we're really at 25 trillion in the United States, we're going to have our own issues. Nobody wants to talk about the national debt in this country. I'm a byproduct back, it's almost 30 years ago when the great businessman, Ross Perot Sr., H. Ross Perot, ran for president in 1992 as an independent. He was making, as part of his whole platform, the $4 trillion of debt that the United States was dealing with. Now, this is less than 30 years ago. And so today, based on whatever survey and whatever numbers you want to look at, $22 to $25 trillion of debt is not going to be sustainable. And we've got to figure out how we do what the immigrant decided that he needed to do by even coming to this country and leave a better life for our children and our grandchildren. We're not going to be able to leave a better life for our children and our grandchildren with $25 trillion of debt. So that's something that we're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to deal with, we're going to have to understand, etc. It's very interesting when you look at the news and you take a look at what happens with people's confidence in the media, okay? And I am not, I'm not going to become political. We are not on this show going to call out media members. We're not going to call out their companies. We're not going to do that. It doesn't solve anything, okay? That's nothing but just a bunch of rhetoric that we're trying to get away from. But when you really take a look, people don't have the confidence in their sources of information through the media that they had years and years ago. I can give you some statistics. I mean, you just take a look at these statistics. Today's trust in the media, 41%. All right? Now, that's an average. Now, somebody could sit up and say, well, it's 51%. Trust in the media is 41%. 51.2% of the people believe that the media is credible. Now, that's pretty bad. When you really think about it, that means almost half the people that are watching the news don't believe it's credible. I mean, that's an amazing statistic. Now we say, okay, well, that's kind of what's going on here. Well, let's look at Europe. In Italy, France, and Spain, and the UK, 43% consider the media to be trustworthy as it relates to the COVID-19 issue. 43% in those countries consider that their media is telling them the truth. Now, what causes all of this? I mean, what is the issue that surrounds all of this? Well, here in the United States, and then we'll talk about Europe, it's a bunch of politicians using the COVID-19 pandemic for their own political agendas. And you want to know what? That doesn't solve anything. It doesn't help anyone. That's not why we elected people not only to go to Washington, but in our state houses or even in our local communities. It's not why we, as Americans, decided that we were going to send these people to represent us. Now, in Europe, in France, in Spain, and in Italy especially, okay, there's always been a quandary because of the form of government. There's always been a quandary with the media. Are they telling us the truth? Why are we paying so much money in taxes? What about our pensions? What about this? What about that? But there's always been a quandary as it relates to it. But the numbers that I just gave you are current numbers, and they come out of a scenario that, quite frankly, is not acceptable to anybody. Not acceptable to anybody. It certainly isn't acceptable to me, which is why now I'm taking the time and spending the energy with a great team to be able to have the To Be Frank show, to be able to try to be an antidote to what is out there and be able to give people information. That's the key. You know, we take a look again today in the United States, just on the COVID scenario. You've got, 2.5 million cases from the start of this. You've got 125,000 deaths, right? And nobody can be happy about that. And the hospitalizations, especially here in Texas, have really skyrocketed. And that is very concerning. Today, they made an announcement that elective surgeries are now going to be put off again. And that happened 2 months ago. I have a good friend that's a spine surgeon, and that happened 2 months ago, where any elective surgery that wasn't life-threatening was put off. They made an announcement today that hospitals now, especially in Dallas and Houston, are going to having to go back to that model because there's a surge now in COVID-19 hospitalizations. That's scary. That's scary. And we're going to get into, with guests, the first 3 shows that are going to air. We're going to air this show on Mondays and Thursdays. And the times will be posted out there. We're going to have this show, and we're going to have guests, and we're going to have really smart people that are going to be able to really delve into this. And so that's really where this thing is going. You take a look at France, Spain, and Italy. They were in major lockdowns. Now they're coming out of the lockdowns. So the question then becomes, are they going to see the level of spikes that we've seen now, especially in our southern states, as they've come out of the lockdowns? We've been out of these lockdowns now in Florida, Texas, Arizona for about 3 weeks, maybe even over 3 weeks. We've been out of these lockdowns. And we're seeing a tremendous spike. Are the people in France, Spain, and Italy, are they going to now see these spikes? Or because of maybe what they're doing and how they're doing it based on their form of government, are they going to be more in a lockdown than maybe we were when we came out of it? These are the things that we're really going to try to understand, because it's one world when it comes to the COVID issue. It's one world. And we're going to dedicate in the first shows between that and Black Lives Matters, we're going to really dedicate a lot of our airtime to those 2 subjects. And I think they really, need to be covered. I'll give you an incredible misnomer, and we're not going to sit here and blame anybody. But as of today, the Chinese have posted that since the COVID-19 issue started in Wuhan, China, sometime beginning of this year, December, January, whenever it started, and how it started, that they posted that they have had 84,000 cases and 4,500 deaths. Now, if those statistics are right, somebody out there that's watching this needs to get a hold of Elon Musk, and I'll be the next astronaut on the next SpaceX flight, if that is credible information. They have 1.5 billion people. That's something that is an impossibility. So we have to question things even about the numbers that we're seeing. And we're going to get people hopefully on this show that are going to be able to verify those things and be able to talk about those things. But certainly the Chinese numbers don't hold any water. And so we need to get down to that for the people of China to really be able to understand this. So that's really what this is going to be about. This show is really going to be about giving people the information that my team and I believe they're not getting in the television medium that they're dealing with around the world, that they're not getting the information. They're getting homogenized information and pasteurized information that is skewed by all kinds of things that I mentioned. We're going to handle a segment of political issues, but we're not going to become political. You're not going to hear endorsements, or you're not going to hear political spew on this show. There are certain political things that we're going to have to cover, but we're not going to tell you who to vote for. We're not going to tell you why you have to vote that way. We're not going to tell you what's wrong with everybody. Just remember from the great band back in the 60s And remember the song. The song is For What It's Worth. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Just remember that song. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Stephen Stills sang it. And, it really is, I think, a great reminder that we just can't continue, not only in the United States, but in the world, to continue to operate the way that we're operating with this division and really spewed with a lot of hate and vitriol. It doesn't work. It's not lending itself to, positive things that are going to occur, and we've got to change some of that. And hopefully this show can be a show that ultimately tries to cover these things and tries to cover them objectively, again, without any political bias. So as a close, I would say that I'm really excited to do this. We are, the To Be Frank show is now listed and up on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And we've got really smart people that are handling all of that and putting out the information and putting the shows out. And we'd like to hear from you about what you think. And because ultimately that's really what the dialogue that must occur, not only in this country but around the world as it relates to some of these incredible things that we're facing. So in closing again, I want to tell you that I'm really excited about doing this, and I hope that everyone out there not only enjoys the information that we're going to provide, but becomes a part of what we're actually trying to do here, because input and dialogue is the most important thing. So thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday and Thursday with segments of some of the things that I've talked about today. And really, in the beginning, it's going to be COVID and Black Lives Matter related. So we're looking forward to it. We're going to have some great guests on, and can't wait for Monday. So everyone have a great day, and thank you for watching.